kind enough, as always, with her time. She's a Homeland Security Department and immigration policy reporter over at NPR. Friend of the show, Ximena Bustillo. Ximena, always good to see you.
Hey, Mike.
So I'm so happy that you're back on the program because, all this immigration news, you're one of the people I thought about. I want to ask you something with respect to the campaign trail and maybe touching base with some folks on immigration. You met with a lot of folks in Arizona and different places, but let me ask you, because we haven't had you on the show since the Trump administration has come in. I just read your fancy new title over at NPR, so congratulations there. And you're
Thanks.
covering a lot of this. What has been these last 6 months with the administration now and Trump taking over? What has it been like from the immigration purview? Does it feel like we're inundated with so much information, Alien Enemies Act, all these other things? What has it been like for somebody that's been covering it now as part of your beat?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we started this administration with a first set of executive actions that the president signed on his very first day in office. And I would say for the most part, he's doing everything that he promised. He said on the campaign trail that he was going to limit entry into the United States. And he's done that, limiting access to asylum and access to seeking refuge in the United States. He said that he was going to take steps to reinterpret the 14th Amendment and limit birthright citizenship. And that was one of the first executive orders that we saw. And he said that he was going to use special privileges that the president gets, such as the Alien Enemies Act, that 18th century wartime power, particularly to speed and streamline deportations. And yes, and he's done it. So, this is what the administration has been touting as promises made and promises kept. We are seeing a higher and faster speed of processing arrests and deportations. But, at the same time, throughout this process, we are also seeing these policies impact groups of people that previously did not think would be impacted by any administration's effort to quote unquote do mass deportations, thinking about efforts for students and targeting student visas, people who are in their green card processes, people who have already gone through that, and kind of like what that means for what this administration wants to signal in its immigration agenda.
So much there, the CBP app getting canceled with President Biden. Obviously, that used to be the app under DHS, and now they don't use that anymore. There's so much immigration news. We've had a bunch of attorneys covering it. It's the first thing I thought of because I know that you obviously switched over your beat and started covering this. But you just mentioned something there I did want to ask you about because I heard you on the NPR Politics podcast and you were talking about the Alien Enemies Act and something that kind of it didn't sweep under the rug, but it kind of maybe passed a little bit of the news cycle. Maybe people don't realize that the Supreme Court weighed in on the Alien Enemies Act and the usage of it. Why don't you explain a little bit more of kind of what the Supreme Court weighed in here and how it is affecting or speeding up or slowing down these deportations that the president wants to do?
Mm-hmm. So it's important to note that the Supreme Court has not yet decided on the merits of whether the Alien Enemies Act is being used by the president lawfully. That is not a question that they've taken up, and it's not something that they've decided. But through their decisions, they have effectively, for now, allowed the president to continue to use it to streamline its deportations. President Trump wants to use the Alien Enemies Act because going through this process, you don't have to go through the traditional immigration courts procedure that you do for a lot of other deportations. It is basically an additional form of expedited removal where someone can be deemed deportable and then quickly removed from the country. In this case, if they are also deemed an alien enemy. Now, what the Supreme Court has ruled is that those people who are deemed alien enemies should get a chance to contest their deportation under the act before they are put on a plane and sent to another country. That came out of a decision following DC District Court ruling that was looking at the first set of flights, 3 flights that went from Texas to El Salvador, carrying over 200 men, amongst other folks, but over 200 men, particularly deported under this act. They were Venezuelan and are being accused accused of being Tren de Aragua gang members. But, lawyers and attorneys said that those men never got a chance to contest that specific allegation. And some of them were actively going through their immigration court process when they were put on a plane and sent to El Salvador to a mega prison there. So then after that, the Supreme Court decided that people need a chance to defend themselves. They need to have a chance to argue their own responses to being deported under this act specifically. There was also a separate decision that said that people had to bring their claims individually. This was an appeals decision. People have to bring their claims individually in the individual district courts. So at first, there were immigrant rights groups that wanted to sue on behalf of everyone in the United States that could possibly be affected by this act. And the courts said, no, people need to either get into groups or sue individually in the districts that they're in. If that sounds complicated, it's a bit because it is. It means that now we are seeing individualized lawsuits all over the country. In fact, there was a hearing today in Western Pennsylvania on one of these cases, people who were being attempted to be removed under the Alien Enemies Act that now have to sue to stop that individually. So what happened in Texas is there's been several injunctions, but one of the detention centers in North Texas was not yet covered by one of these injunctions. And lawyers found out that their clients were about to be deported within a matter of hours under the Alien Enemies Act, and they sued to stop that. The Supreme Court upheld it, and then the Supreme Court upheld it again, agreeing that those men had not been given enough time to contest the allegations that they are members of a gang, that they're an alien enemy, and that they should be deported under this act. So they have still not ruled on whether or not whether or not the use of this act is legally appropriate, but they have punted back to the lower courts to decide how much time someone should be given before they're deported under the act. And they have created an injunction on that specific North Texas facility that people cannot get removed under the act until those time decisions are made. It's really complicated, but at the end of the day, the justices even on the Supreme Court said that it can be the difference between someone being accidentally sent out of the country or being accused of being something that they're not. And then once they're out of the country, the Trump administration has made it very clear that there is nothing that the courts can do about it. And so that is something that in the decision, the justices have acknowledged, and that is kind of where their focus is right now.
There's a few follow-ups in there because you mentioned about the Supreme Court. We know about the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case and facilitate, and it feels like that hasn't been facilitated enough. And then there was like the interpretation of facilitate and what the court's decision was. But I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned a bunch there about lawyers that potentially you have talked to, maybe some involved in this case, maybe just others that are involved in immigration law itself. The ones that we've had on this program, and then whenever I talk to lawyers, former federal prosecutors, et cetera, I get a lot of mixed answers. Like, yeah, there's creative legal strategies. I'm all for listening to creative legal strategies like the Alien Enemies Act, right? Dusting that off and taking that for a spin, as one attorney said on this show. But when you talk to lawyers, whether it be working with this case or just immigration law in general, is this something that's completely out of the ordinary that they're seeing that the Trump administration is doing in terms of testing the legal limits? Or is it just something where like, no, look, these are laws and there's interpretations of it and everybody can have their day in court? Because we even saw Stephen Miller talking about suspending habeas corpus, which first-year law students know is the right to defend yourself. So what do you make of, or at least what's the sentiment amongst attorneys that you talk to in this space?
I mean, I think that it was pretty clear to them from the beginning that the Trump administration was going to come in and use, as many tools in its toolbox that it can. And that's what we have seen since those first executive actions were first brought on that first day, was kind of laying the groundwork for what eventually has been the enacting of some of these specific presidential powers. And whatever else is to come throughout the course of the next 4 years. But the use of the Alien Enemies Act specifically in this purpose is unprecedented in various ways. And I think lawyers will tell you that using it, particularly as a form of immigration control is particularly unique. But then you also have kind of like the idea that the alien enemy is not necessarily a specific foreign nation. It is not a nation we are actively in war with, which is probably the most unprecedented way of using this act. The only about 3 other times it's been used before, we were in active war with another country. And so, I think that kind of thinking about, what is the interpretation of an invasion? What is the interpretation of an alien enemy? Those are very specific terms that this administration is using to be able to unlock these powers in a way that they haven't necessarily been done before.
Ximena, before you got this all new fancy title at NPR, and now you're covering DHS and tracking down Trish McLaughlin and some quotes from those folks. You were covering a lot on the campaign trail with respect to immigration. We saw voter exit polls about immigration being almost neck and neck with the economy, right? I was curious as I invited you on today. I was like, you know what? Let me ask Ximena, has she followed up with any of these folks that she talked to on the campaign trail? Because I know you were out in Arizona. You did a lot on swing states. Obviously, Arizona has a lot of Latino immigrants. I'm down here in Miami where TPS status is potentially being revoked for Venezuelans and Cubans and some Haitians that live down here in this area. So, what has been the sentiment of talking to people now that they've seen potentially their votes be reflected in terms of new immigration policy and how it's affecting themselves and their families? What has been the sentiment and mood from folks on the trail?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I haven't had that much of an opportunity to pivot back to my Arizona reporting roots of the 2024 election. But we have been doing a lot of really great polling that generally shows that, immigration continues to be one of those issues that is deeply split by party lines. But then once you really start asking about the nitty-gritty of individual policies, such as revoking birthright citizenship, for example, that's where you kind of start to see support even amongst Republicans, especially, I mean, among Republicans, which are the ones that primarily support the president's policies, start to waver a little bit. I'd be willing to take a wager on Arizona with it being a border state. And, about a year and a half ago, it was facing still some really high border crossing numbers. At this point, we really are seeing record low border crossing numbers. And that is something that this administration is boasting. And so, that's definitely has to be a bit of a change down there for those communities that were needing to, figure out how to juggle the crossings at the border with the limited resources that they were getting from the federal government at the same time. But you were seeing a lot of fear in communities. And, when you think about a state like Arizona, that's one of the states that voted in to allow local law enforcement to be more active with immigration and customs enforcement officials. There are limits on that voter measure ballot, but that was kind of a sentiment that voters also had there as well. And even just looking at the delegation, you have incoming Senator Ruben Gallego, who has been very critical of Democrats' approach to immigration and has put out his own plan to kind of tackle the issue, trying to pave a way for his party in that way. So, Arizona is definitely a place I need to go back to. It's probably pretty indicative on how a lot of people are feeling about the issues right now. But at the same time, we're still 6 months in. It's really too early to tell. And I think a lot of people are still in a wait and see mode.
Well, let's get into somewhere else where you recently traveled that I'm kind of jealous, and some reporting that you've done. You've been posting on social media. That was Kentucky for the Kentucky Derby, and you did a great story about. And a lot of people, if you don't follow horse racing, you may not know a lot about this. So you probably know about the jockeys, but you don't know that a lot of them are not from this country. And you did something about the horse racing industry bracing for this crackdown on illegal immigration. Tell our audience a little bit about the story, because this is one industry, again, highly visible, on display on NBC. Everyone watches the Kentucky Derby, at least bets on the Kentucky Derby, but this industry could potentially be hit because of the employment of these jockeys. So why don't you take our audience inside that article?
Yeah, the horse racing series it was pretty fascinating because it is indicative of what a lot of industries are feeling right now. But horse racing is kind of that interesting mix between, what you see as like agriculture adjacent, but also kind of entertainment. Like you mentioned, it's on TV. Everyone kind of knows the Kentucky Derby, the big hats, the mint juleps. Like it's a whole vibe, right? And so it's kind of like this interesting mix of like agriculture adjacent in the production, but then, in the promotion, it is very like entertainment, hospitality side of an industry. And its workforce is very diverse, and I mean that in every way, shape, or form. Like the workers, a lot of them are H-2B visa holders, which is for temporary non-agriculture work. And then there are a lot of workers without authorization, and a lot of them come from countries like Central and South America, particularly Jamaica as well. And so you get kind of like an interesting eclectic mix of workers on the backside of the track. And so I talked with a lot of trainers, with a lot of owners kind of throughout the country about just what the sentiment was with this new administration coming in, with a really big focus on worksite enforcement to start. That is something that we heard Border Czar Tom Homan say from his very first network interviews, was that they were going to crack down on unauthorized workers and on employers who were hiring workers without authorization, whether those employers were doing it knowingly or not. And, by and large, there are a lot of industries such as agriculture, horse racing is agriculture adjacent, construction, etc., that were roughly left alone during the first Trump administration as they ramped up their worksite enforcement, back then around 2018, 2019. And they were kind of hoping that they'd be left out again this time. Even if there's this tough on immigration rhetoric, that the Trump administration would recognize that there are some industries in the United States that if you told all those workers to leave, those industries would completely crumble from one day to the next. However, the united message of the Trump administration, even to Republicans who are asking about this on Capitol Hill, is those workers have to leave. And that is that self-deportation message that we are really getting loud and clear from the administration. There are a lot of caveats as to whether or not that's effective messaging, if you can actually get millions of people to just do that by themselves, enough to, really break a mold. But it's still the message that they're getting. And so there's a little bit of a mixed sentiment amongst folks and industry leaders that, say, they were left alone last time. They hope that the president understands their need and leaves them alone. But the public messaging from the administration is just a lot more united and hardline this time, which is really making people hesitate.
Well, it's a fantastic read. I highly encourage people to go check it out over at npr.org. And again, I'm a big horse racing fan, and Preakness was just happening recently. So journalism won. Hopefully journalism can continue to win. See how I land the plane here, Ximena? This is how you do it right here. Go check out all of Ximena's work over at npr.org. She's covering Homeland Security Immigration latest. Follow her on social media. Ximena, I can't thank you enough for hopping on the program. Continued success. Please, as always, stay safe.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Mike.